My name is Diana Miller, and I was 32 years old when I finally understood where I stood in my own family. I had always known, in a quiet way, the kind of knowing you learn to live with. But understanding it clearly came much later, when everything I had spent years minimizing was suddenly placed under bright lights. I worked as a public elementary school teacher. I taught third grade at a small school just outside the city. My days were filled with spelling lists, math worksheets, and kids who asked questions that reminded me why patience mattered. It was not glamorous. It did not come with titles or bonuses, but it mattered to me. In my family, that was the problem. The Miller family valued success that could be measured: income, influence, recognition, the kind of success that came with business cards and applause at dinner parties. And at the center of that world was my father, Richard Miller. He was a well-known figure in his industry, a man who had spent decades building connections, closing deals, and establishing a reputation that commanded respect. People listened when he spoke. People stood a little straighter when he entered a room. He was preparing to retire, and not quietly. The retirement dinner had been in planning for months, a formal event at a high-end venue, hundreds of guests, colleagues, business partners, friends who shared the same social circles. Everything about it was designed to reflect the life he had built. My mother spoke about it constantly: the guest list, the seating, the speeches. She treated it like a final presentation of the family legacy. In that presentation, my role was unclear. Growing up, I was never the difficult child. I did well in school, I followed rules, I stayed out of trouble, but I was also never the one my parents bragged about. That role belonged to my older sister, Angela Miller. Angela had chosen a path that aligned perfectly with the family image. She worked in corporate leadership. She had a title people recognized. She wore confidence like a uniform. At family gatherings, conversations naturally drifted toward her projects, her achievements, her next steps. People asked her questions. People listened. When they turned to me, the tone changed. How is teaching? Are you still at the same school? That must be rewarding in its own way. It was never said outright, but the message was consistent. My work was kind. Angela's work was impressive. That difference followed us into adulthood. When I announced that I was becoming a teacher, my parents smiled politely. My mother said it was nice that I wanted to help children. My father nodded and asked if I had considered something with more growth potential. Angela announced promotions, new roles, strategic projects. Each announcement was met with celebration. I learned to keep my accomplishments small in family conversations, to avoid comparisons, to keep the peace. The retirement dinner brought all of this to the surface. As the date approached, my mother called to confirm details: what I would wear, when I should arrive, where I would be seated. She reminded me to be mindful of what I talked about. There will be important people there, she said. This is not the place for casual stories. I understood what she meant. Do not talk about your classroom. Do not talk about your students. Do not remind people of what you chose. Angela, on the other hand, was encouraged to mingle, to network, to represent the family well. The dinner was not just a celebration, it was a stage, and my father was the main character. In the weeks leading up to the event, I felt a familiar tension settle in, the kind I always felt before family milestones, the pressure to perform a role I had not chosen. I asked myself whether I was being too sensitive, whether this was just how families worked, whether I should be grateful to be included at all. That questioning was automatic by then. The night of the dinner arrived. The venue was elegant, soft lighting, white tablecloths, live music playing quietly in the background. Guests moved through the space with confidence, greeting one another like members of a private world. I arrived with my husband and stood near the entrance for a moment, taking it in. He squeezed my hand gently. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. I always did. Inside, the seating arrangement made the hierarchy clear without a word being spoken. Angela and her partner were placed near the front, close to the stage, surrounded by people my parents considered important. We were seated farther back, near the side, not hidden, but not central. As people took their seats, I watched my father move through the room, shaking hands, laughing, accepting praise. This was his environment. He looked comfortable, confident. This was his world, and I was visiting it. The dinner began with speeches planned and practiced, stories about leadership, about vision. about success. People applauded at the right moments. I clapped along, feeling strangely detached. When my father finally took the stage, the room quieted immediately. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about his career, his mentors, his accomplishments. Then he spoke about family. He gestured toward my mother, toward Angela. He spoke about pride, about legacy. When he mentioned me, it was brief, casual, a reference, not a celebration. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the moment I realized something important. This dinner was not just about his retirement. It was about reminding everyone, including me, where I fit in the story. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were invited into a room, but never truly welcomed in the narrative being told there? If that resonates with you, leave a comment with the number 1. I want to know how many people understand this feeling. Because in part 2, I will take you deeper into the patterns that led to this moment and why what happened next could not be dismissed as a single careless comment. Marcus Lee entered my life quietly. There was no dramatic introduction, no instant approval. We met through mutual friends, talked for hours about ordinary things, and built something steady over time. He listened more than he spoke. He paid attention to details other people missed. He never tried to impress anyone. That alone made him an anomaly in my family. When I first told my parents about him, they asked the same questions they always did. What does he do? Where did he go to school? What are his long-term plans? I answered honestly. I said he worked in education. That was technically true. My mother smiled politely and changed the subject. My father nodded and said teaching was important work, then immediately asked whether Marcus planned to move into administration or something more scalable. Angela asked fewer questions. She glanced at her phone and said it sounded nice. From the beginning, Marcus was categorized: safe, harmless, unremarkable. He did not challenge that perception. He never corrected it. When people asked vague questions, he gave simple answers. When they lost interest, he did not chase their attention. I noticed everything. At our first holiday dinner together, Marcus brought wine and helped clear the table without being asked. He thanked my mother for the meal and complimented the food. He sat patiently while conversations flowed around him. No one asked him about his work beyond the initial polite inquiry. When Angela spoke about a new project, the room leaned in. When Marcus mentioned working with schools, someone interrupted to ask about dessert. It happened again and again. At birthdays, at anniversaries, at casual Sunday lunches. Marcus was always present, always respectful, always slightly outside the circle of interest. My mother would ask Angela detailed questions about her schedule, her team, her goals. She asked Marcus whether he enjoyed having summers off. My father would discuss investments and industry news with Angela's partner. He asked Marcus whether he found teaching fulfilling. The contrast was subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to feel. I saw the way my parents' eyes glazed over when Marcus spoke, the way my sister smiled with a hint of amusement, as if she had already decided who he was. They were disappointed, not in his character, in his perceived status. When Marcus proposed, the reaction was muted. My mother asked whether we were ready, whether we had thought through finances, whether marriage made sense at this stage. Angela congratulated us and immediately asked where we planned to live, implying it might not be anywhere impressive. My father shook Marcus' hand and said welcome to the family, then suggested we keep the wedding small. I told myself not to read too much into it. Marcus never commented. Not once. He never complained. He never asked why he was treated differently. If anything, he seemed to understand the dynamic instinctively. When we married, he told me something that stayed with me. We do not need their approval to build our life, he said. At the time, I thought he was reassuring me. I did not realize he was stating a boundary. Over the years, the pattern settled into something predictable. Marcus attended family events with me. He stood beside me. He made conversation when spoken to. He did not insert himself into spaces where he was not invited. My family interpreted that as passivity. Angela once joked that Marcus was very low-key, that she barely noticed him in a room full of people. My mother laughed. My father nodded. I felt my chest tighten, but I said nothing. Silence was easier. It became my default response. When comments were dismissive, I told myself they were harmless. When questions were shallow, I answered politely and moved on. Marcus never asked me to defend him. That made it harder. There were moments when I wanted him to push back, to assert himself, to say something impressive that would force my family to reassess him. But that desire was rooted in the same system that made me feel small. Marcus did not need to perform. He knew who he was. The longer we were married, the clearer the gap became between how my family viewed Marcus and how the rest of the world did. Friends respected him, colleagues sought his advice, people trusted his judgment, but my family remained fixed on a version of him they had created in their own minds. A man without leverage, without authority, without relevance. I knew this would eventually lead to conflict. Not because Marcus would change, but because my family would push further. They always did. The retirement dinner was the perfect environment for that push. A public stage, an audience that mattered to them, a chance to reinforce the hierarchy. I sensed it even before we arrived. The way my mother reminded me to dress appropriately, the way she suggested Marcus keep conversations light, the way Angela hinted that some guests might not understand our lifestyle. Marcus noticed too. Before we entered the venue, he asked me a quiet question. "Are you okay with tonight?" I told him I was. It was easier than explaining the mix of anticipation and dread swirling inside me. What I did not know then was that my family had already decided how the night would go. They assumed Marcus would remain invisible, that I would remain accommodating, that nothing would disrupt the narrative they had built. They underestimated one thing. Marcus did not need recognition. He did not need approval, and he did not need to speak until the moment truly mattered. In part 3, I will take you into the small but cutting moments that unfolded throughout the dinner, the jokes disguised as praise, and the line my father crossed that turned years of quiet dismissal into a public reckoning. What happened at my father's retirement dinner did not begin that night. It had been building for years. Long before the speeches, the applause, and the quiet smile my sister wore from across the room, there were smaller moments. Moments that seemed harmless on their own. Easy to dismiss, easy to excuse. But together, they formed a pattern. Every Thanksgiving followed the same rhythm. The table would fill, plates would be passed. Conversation would circle around careers and accomplishments. When Angela spoke about a new role or a successful project, the room leaned toward her. My parents asked follow-up questions. They smiled with pride. They repeated her words as if committing them to memory. When it was my turn to speak, the energy shifted. I would mention a student who had finally learned to read fluently, or a class project that brought kids together in ways that surprised me. I spoke with the same care and enthusiasm Angela used when describing her work. The response was always polite. "That must be nice," my mother would say. "Teaching is so meaningful," my father would add. Then someone would check their phone. Someone else would ask Angela another question. The moment would pass. At first, I told myself it was normal. Not everyone understood teaching. Not everyone connected with stories about classrooms. I learned to shorten my answers, to summarize instead of explain, to keep things light. Christmas was no different. Angela gifts were praised for their thoughtfulness and cost. My gifts were described as sweet, practical, simple, words that sounded kind but landed flat. One year, my aunt asked me whether I planned to move into a bigger school someday. She meant it as encouragement, but the implication lingered. Small school, small work, small ambition. Angela smiled sympathetically from across the room. When Marcus joined the family, the comments shifted slightly. "At least you found a husband," someone joked. "Not everyone needs a big career," my mother said. "You seem happy. That is what matters." Happy became the ceiling. It was not an insult. It was a limit. I noticed how often my family used diminutives when referring to my life. Your little classroom, your simple schedule, your modest goals. They never used those words with Angela. Her work was complex. Her projects were ambitious. Her future was exciting. I absorbed these differences quietly. I told myself I was imagining them, that I was being sensitive, that I should not compare. Marcus noticed before I admitted it to myself. After one dinner, he asked me why no one had asked about my work when I had clearly wanted to talk about it. I shrugged and said it was not a big deal. He did not argue. He just nodded. The pattern continued. At birthdays, my parents toasted Angela achievements. At anniversaries, they joked about how different our lives turned out. When extended family visited, Angela was introduced first with context and praise. This is Angela. She works in corporate leadership. This is Diana. She teaches. The pause between those sentences said everything. It was not malicious. That is what made it harder to confront. No one raised their voice. No one openly mocked me. The disrespect lived in what was not said, in the assumptions that followed me into every room. Over time, I learned to expect it. I stopped bringing up new projects. I stopped sharing ideas. I stopped offering details that would not be received. I became quieter, and in my family, quiet was interpreted as agreement. By the time my father's retirement dinner approached, the environment was already set. My mother reminded me several times to be mindful of conversations. She suggested I avoid talking too much about school. She said people might not relate. Angela offered to introduce me to some guests, then laughed and said she would not know how to explain what I did anyway. Marcus stood beside me during these exchanges, calm and observant. He never corrected anyone. He never defended himself. He never challenged the narrative. That silence was not weakness. It was restraint. I did not realize then how much weight it carried. At the dinner, those years of small dismissals came together. The jokes were subtle. Comments framed as humor, praises that contained barbs. Someone at our table asked Angela about her next move. Someone else asked Marcus whether he enjoyed having a flexible schedule. My father smiled when he heard that question. Flexibility can be nice, he said. Not everyone needs pressure. It was said casually, almost kindly. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. I told myself it would pass, that it was just one night, that I could get through it like I always had. But there is a difference between enduring something quietly and being asked to endure it publicly. That difference matters. As the speeches continued, I watched my father soak in the attention. I watched Angela beam. I watched guests nod and laugh at the right moments. And I realized something uncomfortable. The story being told that night had no place for me. Not because I did not belong, but because my role had already been written. I was the supporting character. The contrast, the example of a path not taken, the small comments over the years had prepared everyone for this moment. They made what came next feel natural to them. That is what made it hurt. Because when the final line was delivered, it did not come out of nowhere. It landed exactly where years of quiet dismissal had pointed. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked back and realized that a moment that hurt deeply was actually the result of many smaller moments you were told not to take seriously? If that sounds familiar, leave a comment with the number 1. I want to know how many people recognize this pattern, because in part 4, I will take you into the exact moment my father crossed the line, and how silence finally gave way to something none of us expected. The retirement dinner was designed to impress. Everything about it signaled importance. The venue was a large ballroom in a historic hotel downtown, the kind of place with high ceilings and soft lighting that made even ordinary conversations feel elevated. A small jazz band played near the stage, their music blending into the low hum of confident voices and polished laughter. People greeted one another like they belonged there. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, business cards exchanged with practiced ease. These were my parents' people, the world they had spent decades cultivating. Marcus and I arrived on time. We checked our names at the entrance and followed an usher through rows of round tables draped in white linen. As we walked deeper into the room, I searched for our table number. It was not near the front. We were guided toward the side, close enough to hear the band, but far enough that the stage felt distant. Our table sat near the service area, where waitstaff moved in and out quietly. Not hidden, but clearly peripheral. I noticed before Marcus did. Then I saw him register it too. He did not react. He pulled out my chair and waited for me to sit before taking his place beside me. Around us, conversations flowed easily. People talked about markets and mergers, about leadership and legacy. I recognized some of the names being mentioned. These were people my father admired, people he had wanted to impress for years. Angela sat at a table closer to the stage. When she saw us, she smiled briefly and looked away. She was already engaged in conversation with guests who leaned toward her attentively. The seating spoke without words. This was where we belonged in the hierarchy. As dinner was served, My parents moved through the room, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. My father looked energized. He laughed loudly. He shook hands firmly. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Eventually, the music softened and the lights dimmed slightly. It was time for the speeches. The host introduced my father with glowing praise. A career built from nothing, decades of leadership, a man who shaped his industry. The applause was long and enthusiastic. My father stepped onto the stage and waited for the room to quiet. He smiled as he looked out over the crowd. He looked proud. He began by thanking his colleagues, his partners, his friends. He told stories about long nights and difficult decisions. People nodded along, recognizing themselves in his words. Then he spoke about family. He gestured toward my mother, seated near the front. He praised her support. He spoke about sacrifice and partnership. The room responded warmly. He gestured toward Angela next. He spoke about ambition, about drive, about carrying the family name forward. People applauded again. Angela smiled, accepting the moment effortlessly. Then he mentioned me. It was brief at first. He said I had chosen a different path. He said not everyone was meant for pressure. He said fulfillment came in many forms. The room chuckled politely. I felt Marcus shift slightly beside me. My father continued. He said some people valued stability over achievement. He said some people preferred comfort to challenge. He said that was their choice. Then he laughed, and he said the line that changed everything. He said I had chosen the walls of a dead woman over the honor of my own blood. The room went silent for half a second. Then laughter rippled outward. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. I felt the sound more than I heard it. A wave that moved through the space and settled heavily on my chest. Angela laughed openly. She did not look at me. She looked at the people around her, sharing the moment. My mother smiled tightly. She did not intervene. I sat frozen. The words echoed in my head, stripped of context, reduced to their core. Walls, dead woman, blood. This was not a joke. This was a judgment. A public one. I felt heat rise in my face. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to shock. The kind that makes the room feel unreal, like you are watching yourself from a distance. I looked around the table. Some guests avoided my eyes. Others looked curious. A few looked uncomfortable. But no one spoke. My father continued his speech as if nothing had happened. He wrapped it in humor, in charm, in the confidence that comes from believing no one will challenge you. Marcus did not move. He did not stand. He did not speak. He did not react. He sat beside me, steady. That steadiness grounded me more than any words could have. As the applause returned and the speech concluded, I realized something important. This moment had not been accidental. It was rehearsed, calculated, permitted. Years of small dismissals had led here. This was simply the first time it had been done with a microphone. I felt exposed, not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to. This was my family. This was my community. This was my life, reduced to a punchline. I expected Marcus to say something afterward, to ask if I was okay, to suggest we leave. He did none of that. He stayed present. That presence told me everything. Whatever happened next would not be emotional. It would not be reactive. It would be deliberate. I did not yet know what he was planning. I only knew that the silence following my father's words was not empty. It was waiting. And in part 5, that silence breaks in a way no one in that room saw coming. For a brief moment after my father finished speaking, the room settled back into polite noise. Applause returned. Glasses clinked. Conversations restarted in careful tones. It was as if the comment had been absorbed into the atmosphere and filed away as entertainment. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. I could feel the eyes of strangers moving toward me and then away again, unsure whether to look or pretend nothing had happened. Marcus did not touch my arm. He did not whisper. He did not lean in to ask if I was okay. He waited. That was when he stood up. The movement was unhurried. He adjusted his jacket calmly, the way someone does when they are preparing to speak with intention rather than emotion. Chairs scraped softly as a few people nearby turned in their seats. The room noticed. Not immediately, but gradually. Like a ripple that spreads once it reaches the right distance, Marcus took a step forward, away from our table. He did not look at my father. He did not look at Angela. He faced the room. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was even, clear, polite. The band stopped playing. The host hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. My father frowned slightly, clearly not expecting an interruption. Marcus smiled politely and continued. My name is Marcus Lee. I am Diana's husband. A few people nodded. That part was familiar. He paused just long enough to let the silence settle. I work in education. There was a soft murmur. That phrase had been used many times before. It was what people expected to hear. Marcus did not stop there. I am the founder and chief executive officer of an education technology company focused on public school infrastructure and access. The reaction was subtle at first. A man near the front leaned toward his table mate. Someone else pulled out a phone. A woman 2 tables away lifted her head sharply, recognition flickering across her face. Marcus continued, still calm. We partner with districts across the country to improve digital access, teacher support, and student outcomes. Our work has been featured in several industry publications over the past few years. A low wave of whispers moved through the room. I saw Angela stiffen. Her smile faded. She glanced around, searching faces for confirmation or denial. One of my father colleagues turned fully in his chair, looking directly at Marcus. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise. Marcus spoke without raising his voice. I normally avoid speaking about work at family events, not out of secrecy, but because I believe my work speaks best through results rather than introductions. He paused. However, I want to clarify something. He looked toward my father for the first time. Diana did not choose walls over family. She chose a life of service and purpose, one that deserves respect, whether or not it fits a particular definition of success. The room was completely silent now. No laughter, no clinking glasses, no movement. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. Angela stared straight ahead, her face pale. Marcus turned back to the room. I apologize for interrupting the evening, he said. I simply felt it was important to correct the narrative. Then he nodded politely and stepped back toward our table. That was all. There was no speech, no lecture, no raised voice, just a statement of fact. The effect was immediate and undeniable. A few guests began whispering openly now. Phones were no longer discreet. Names were being searched. Articles pulled up. Information confirmed. I saw the recognition spread as people connected dots. This was not a secret identity revealed for drama. It was a reality many in the room already knew, but had never associated with me. Someone near the stage whispered Marcus' name to another guest. I heard the words startup and education reform spoken quietly. The host cleared his throat awkwardly and thanked Marcus for sharing. The band resumed playing, but the mood had shifted permanently. My father stood frozen on stage for a moment before stepping down. He did not look in our direction. Angela leaned back in her chair, her earlier confidence completely gone. She avoided eye contact with anyone. At our table, people began turning toward us. A woman introduced herself and said she had followed Marcus' work for years. A man mentioned a conference where he had heard him speak. Another guest congratulated us quietly. Marcus thanked them politely. He did not elaborate. He did not explain. I sat there, stunned. Not because Marcus was successful. I had always known that. But because the room had changed its posture toward me. For the first time, I was not being evaluated through my family lens. I was being seen as part of something credible, substantial, not because of who my father was, but because of who my partner was, and because of who I had always been. My father did not approach us after that. Neither did my mother. Angela left her table early, disappearing into the crowd. The dinner continued, but the narrative had been disrupted. The hierarchy had cracked. As we prepared to leave later that evening, Marcus squeezed my hand gently. You did not deserve that, he said quietly. I know, I replied. Walking out of the ballroom, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Relief. Not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because the truth had finally been allowed to exist in the open. Before we move on, let me ask you something. Do you think quiet dignity is more powerful than loud retaliation? If you have a thought, leave a comment with the number 1. I want to know how this moment reads from your perspective. Because in part 6, the story does not end with that reveal. The aftermath brings consequences no one in that room was prepared for. The shift in the room did not come from argument. It came from verification. After Marcus sat back down, the evening did not return to normal. Conversations resumed, but they moved differently. Quieter. Focused. People were no longer reacting to a speech. They were processing information. I noticed it in small ways. Phones stayed out longer. Names were typed carefully. Whispers turned into confirmations. Guests who had been confident minutes earlier now looked uncertain. Some glanced toward my father, then back at their screens. Others leaned closer to one another, murmuring phrases like education technology and national grants. Marcus did not engage with any of it. He remained exactly as he had been all night. Calm, present, uninterested in managing reactions. That restraint did more than any speech could have. Within minutes, recognition spread. A guest near the front approached our table and introduced herself as someone who worked in public policy. She said she had read about Marcus' work during a district modernization initiative. Another man mentioned a keynote Marcus had given years earlier at a national conference. Each interaction added a layer of legitimacy, not through boasting, not through explanation, through shared recognition. This was social authority in action, the kind that does not need defense. My father watched from a distance. His expression was unreadable now. The confidence he had carried on stage had drained away, replaced by something closer to calculation. Angela did not approach us. She stayed seated for a long time, staring down at the table, then eventually stood and walked toward the back of the room. She did not return. As dessert was served, the host attempted to regain control of the evening. He thanked everyone again and suggested enjoying the rest of the night. The band played softly. The structure of the event continued, but the center had shifted. People no longer gravitated toward my father. They gravitated toward Marcus. He answered questions briefly. He redirected praise. He spoke about teams and teachers, not himself. At one point, someone asked him what first drew him to education. Marcus glanced at me before answering. He said education was where quiet work made the biggest difference. That was all. Later in the evening, when the room had settled into smaller conversations, Marcus stood again. This time, there was no hesitation. People noticed immediately. He asked for a moment, his tone still respectful. "I want to acknowledge something tonight," he said. "Not about myself. About Diana." The room stilled again. Marcus explained that my school had recently been selected for a funding initiative focused on classroom resources and teacher support. He said the decision had been made months earlier, following a review process conducted independently of our family. He emphasized that clearly. He explained that the funding was meant to support teachers who showed commitment beyond expectations. Teachers who stayed late, who adapted, who believed in students when systems failed them. He said my name once. No embellishment, no praise, just context. He said the contribution was significant. He did not mention exact figures. He did not need to. The reaction was immediate. People looked at me differently, not with pity, not with curiosity, with respect. I felt something shift inside my chest, not pride, something steadier, recognition. My father sat rigid in his chair. My mother stared straight ahead. Neither clapped. Angela was not in the room. The announcement was not framed as charity. It was framed as investment, in education, in community, in work that mattered regardless of who acknowledged it. That distinction was everything. The narrative my family had controlled for years unraveled quietly. The idea that success had only one shape. The idea that value had to be visible to count. The idea that status was inherited rather than earned. None of it survived contact with reality. Marcus finished speaking and returned to his seat. There was applause, genuine this time. I sat there, overwhelmed but grounded. For the first time, my presence did not require justification. The evening continued, but my family no longer directed it. Guests approached me directly. They asked about my school, about my students, about my work. The same stories that had once been dismissed were now met with interest. Nothing about them had changed. Only the listener. That was the part that hurt and healed at the same time. Later, as we prepared to leave, my mother approached us cautiously. She congratulated Marcus on his work. She told me she had not realized the extent of his involvement in education. I thanked her politely. My father did not speak to us. The power dynamic had shifted beyond repair. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized something important. This was not revenge. No one had been attacked. No secrets had been exposed maliciously. No insults had been returned. The truth had simply been allowed to stand on its own. And that had been enough. The image my family had curated for decades could not survive facts that contradicted it. They could not minimize what had been verified by others. They could not dismiss what had been recognized publicly. They could not reclaim control over a story that no longer belonged to them. As we walked to the car, Marcus asked me quietly how I felt. I thought for a moment before answering. Lighter, I said, not because they were wrong, but because I no longer had to carry their version of me. In Part 7, the consequences begin to unfold beyond that room. Phone calls are made, narratives are revised, and the cost of maintaining an image becomes impossible to ignore. The morning after the dinner, my phone was already full. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails I did not open right away. The shift did not happen gradually. It happened overnight. My parents, who had once gone weeks without asking how I was doing, suddenly wanted to talk. My mother sent a message saying she hoped we got home safely. My father left a voicemail asking if we could meet for coffee. Angela texted once. Just a single line. We should talk. There was no apology, no explanation, just an assumption that conversation was still available on their terms. I did not respond immediately. That was new for me. In the past, I would have rushed to smooth things over, to reassure them, to prove I was still compliant. That instinct had been shaped by years of trying to stay connected to people who measured worth conditionally. But something had changed. Not in them. In me. For the first time, I could see the pattern clearly. The interest was not about me. It was about control. Now that the narrative they relied on had collapsed publicly, they needed to reestablish their position, to reclaim authority, to rewrite the story in a way that felt safer to them. Marcus saw it too. When I showed him the messages, he did not tell me what to do. He simply asked how I wanted to respond. That question mattered. I realized I did not owe anyone an immediate answer. We took the day slowly, went for a walk, had coffee in silence, let the adrenaline from the night before settle into something calmer. By the afternoon, the messages continued. My mother called again. This time her tone was different, softer, concerned. She said she had not realized how accomplished Marcus was. She said she wished we had shared more. The implication was clear. Why did you let us underestimate you? I recognized the reversal. For years, they had assumed authority because they believed they knew more. Now they felt embarrassed by what they did not know, and they were uncomfortable with that. My father's message was more direct. He said the comment at the dinner had been misunderstood. He said humor sometimes did not land the way it was intended. He said family should talk things out privately. That word again, privately, as if the problem had been exposure, not behavior. Angela's message came later that evening. She said the dinner had been awkward. She said people at work were asking questions. She said she had not expected things to escalate. She did not ask how I felt. She asked how this would affect her. That was when something settled inside me. Clarity. I responded to none of them that day. The next morning, I replied to my mother with a brief message. I thanked her for checking in and said I needed time. No details, no reassurance. To my father, I said I was not interested in discussing the dinner until we could talk honestly about the years leading up to it. To Angela, I said nothing. The silence was not punishment. It was protection. In the days that followed, the tone of communication shifted again. Apologies appeared, tentative and carefully worded. Invitations were extended, dinners suggested. Phrases like, we should move forward and let go were used generously. But something was missing. Accountability. No one acknowledged the pattern. No one named the disrespect. No one addressed the imbalance. They wanted resolution without reflection. Marcus and I talked about it often. He reminded me that boundaries were not walls meant to shut people out. They were definitions meant to clarify what behavior was acceptable. We decided together how much access we wanted to allow. The answer was less than before. We declined invitations that felt performative. We avoided conversations that centered on image repair. We did not engage in debates about intent versus impact. We stayed calm, polite, firm. The power dynamic changed in subtle but lasting ways. My parents no longer spoke with certainty. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They hesitated before offering opinions. Angela stopped contacting me altogether. That distance hurt more than I expected. Not because I missed the relationship we had, but because I had once hoped for one we never truly shared. Letting go of that hope was the hardest part. There was grief in it. Quiet grief. The kind that does not announce itself but settles slowly. I mourned the version of family I had imagined. the idea that one day they would see me clearly without needing proof from the outside world. But I also felt relief. I no longer had to earn respect by proximity to success. I no longer had to justify my choices. I no longer had to stay small to stay connected. Marcus never framed this as a victory. He framed it as alignment. We built routines that centered us rather than family expectation. We spent time with people who asked thoughtful questions, who listened without ranking stories, who respected work because it mattered, not because it impressed. I noticed how much lighter our conversations felt. No rehearsing, no bracing, no translating ourselves. The distance from my family was not dramatic, it was deliberate, and it gave me something I had not realized I was missing. Peace. Before we move forward, I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever noticed that people treat you differently only after your value is confirmed by someone else? If that question hits close to home, leave a comment with the number 1. I want to know how many people have experienced that shift. Because in the final part, I will talk about what this experience taught me about self-worth, family, and the quiet strength of choosing your own life without asking for permission. In the weeks that followed, life did not suddenly become perfect. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional family meeting where everything was finally understood, no moment where the past was rewritten. Instead, there was something quieter: distance. I did not cut my family off completely. I still answered messages when they were respectful. I still showed up for major milestones when it felt appropriate, but I no longer stepped back into the role I had played for most of my life. The role of the one who adjusted, the one who absorbed discomfort, the one who stayed silent to keep things smooth. That version of me was gone. The boundary I set was simple but firm. I would not tolerate being diminished. I would not accept jokes disguised as truth. I would not allow my choices to be ranked against someone else's definition of success. And most importantly, I would not explain myself anymore. That change confused my family. My mother tried to return to old habits, offering suggestions framed as concern. When I did not engage, she stopped. My father attempted a few conversations that circled around the dinner without addressing it directly. I listened, then redirected. Angela never reached out again. At first, that hurt. Then it didn't. Because I finally understood something I had avoided for years. Some relationships exist only as long as you stay in the role they assign you. When you step out of that role, the relationship either evolves or dissolves. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. Marcus and I talked often about what this experience had revealed. Not just about my family, but about how people learn to measure worth. We live in a world that rewards visibility. Titles, numbers, applause. It becomes easy to believe that value only exists when it can be proven publicly. But the truth is quieter than that. Value exists in consistency, in service, in integrity. It exists in showing up when no one is watching. For years, I had internalized the idea that my work mattered less because it did not come with prestige. That belief had shaped how I spoke, how I showed up, how much space I allowed myself to take. I no longer carried it. Teaching did not become more important because someone wealthy acknowledged it. It had always mattered. What changed was my willingness to see myself clearly, regardless of who else did. The dinner did not give me my voice. It revealed that I already had one. The difference was that I no longer waited for permission to use it. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this: silence in the face of disrespect is not noble. It is exhausting. And respect is not something you earn by suffering quietly. It is the baseline requirement for any relationship worth maintaining. Family does not get a free pass to diminish you. Love does not excuse harm. And boundaries are not acts of punishment. They are acts of self-respect. Setting them does not make you cold. It makes you honest. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, know this: you do not have to wait for a public moment to be worthy. You do not need external validation to justify your choices. And you are allowed to step away from narratives that keep you small. Sometimes the most powerful change is not what you say. It is what you stop accepting. Before we close, I want to invite you to engage. If this story gave you something to think about, please like the video. It helps this message reach others who might need it. If you have ever had to set boundaries with family, or if you are still learning how, leave a comment and share your experience. You are not alone in this. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful storytelling that focuses on growth, dignity, and self-worth, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories coming that explore these themes from different angles. In the next video, we will look at another story where expectations collide with reality and where choosing yourself comes at a cost that is not always obvious at first. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary.